My name is Serafina, and at 21 I discovered that blood does not always mean loyalty. The phone call that shattered my world came on a Tuesday evening while I was studying constitutional law in my Harvard dorm room. My mother's voice carried that familiar, manipulative tone as she delivered the bombshell that would change everything. She was forcing me to withdraw from Harvard immediately because my younger sister Melody apparently needed the tuition money more for her art school dreams. The woman who had spent years bragging about her Harvard daughter was now demanding I sacrifice my future for someone who had never even applied herself academically. What she did not know was that I had just uncovered something that would expose the real reason behind this sudden decision, and the truth would destroy our family in ways she never imagined. Before we dive into this wild family revenge story, I would love to know where you are watching from. If this opening has already got your heart racing, please hit that like button and subscribe, because trust me, you will not want to miss how this Harvard betrayal turns into the most satisfying family takedown you have ever heard. The next part will reveal the shocking discovery that changed everything. The conversation with my mother lasted exactly 47 minutes, and every second felt like a knife twisting deeper into my chest. She sat there in our family kitchen, her manicured nails drumming against the marble countertop that I had helped pay for with my part-time job earnings, explaining how Melody had suddenly decided she wanted to attend the prestigious Whitmore Institute of Fine Arts. The tuition was astronomical, she said, and since I was just studying boring legal stuff, it made more sense to invest in Melody's real talent. I stared at this woman who had raised me, searching for any sign of the mother who had once driven me to debate competitions and celebrated every academic achievement. Instead, I found a stranger whose eyes held a coldness I had never noticed before. She spoke about my Harvard education like it was some frivolous hobby, completely dismissing the fact that I had earned a full academic scholarship and was maintaining a perfect grade point average while working 20 hours a week to cover my living expenses. Melody has a gift, Serafina, she continued, her voice taking on that dreamy quality she always used when discussing my sister. She could be the next Georgia O'Keeffe or Frida Kahlo. But you are just going to end up in some corporate law firm anyway. Anyone can be a lawyer. The casual dismissal of everything I had worked for felt like a physical blow. I had spent my entire childhood being the responsible one, the achiever, the daughter who never caused problems. While Melody was out partying and barely graduating high school with a 2.7 grade point average, I had been studying until midnight and volunteering at legal aid clinics. While she was spending money on designer clothes and expensive art supplies, I was saving every penny for my education. But it was what happened next that truly opened my eyes to the depth of this betrayal. As my mother continued her speech about family sacrifice and supporting each other, her phone buzzed with a text message. The screen lit up, and I caught a glimpse of the sender's name that made my blood run cold. Richard Whitmore. As in Richard Whitmore, the 50-something divorced father of my sister's best friend Emma, who also happened to be the biggest donor to the Whitmore Institute. The pieces began clicking together with horrifying clarity. My mother's sudden interest in Melody's artistic career, the mysterious family friend who had been helping with college applications, the expensive dinners and weekend trips that my mother claimed were networking opportunities for Melody's future. I excused myself to the bathroom, my mind racing as I tried to process what I was seeing. My mother, who had been married to my father for 25 years, was having an affair. Not just any affair, but one with a man whose family name was literally on the building where she wanted to send my sister. This was not about Melody's talent or my mother's sudden change of heart about my education. This was about my mother trading my future for her own selfish desires. The next few hours passed in a blur of careful investigation. I had always been good at research, and growing up in a house where my mother managed my father's law practice had taught me where people keep their important documents. While she was taking what she called a business call in the garden, I accessed her laptop using the password she had never bothered to change. What I found there made me physically sick. Months of emails between my mother and Richard Whitmore discussing everything from hotel reservations to investment opportunities. Messages about how Richard could guarantee Melody's acceptance to Whitmore Institute, and even arrange for a generous scholarship that would cover most of her tuition. In exchange, my mother would invest the money she saved on my Harvard education into Richard's struggling tech startup. But the most devastating discovery was a forwarded email chain where my mother was laughing about the situation with Richard. She had written, "Serafina is so naive. She actually thinks this is about supporting her sister's dreams. The girl has always been too serious anyway. Maybe dropping out will teach her that life is not just about grades and achievements." I sat there in my childhood bedroom, surrounded by debate trophies and academic awards, reading about how my own mother viewed my dedication and hard work as character flaws that needed to be corrected. The woman who had spent years telling me how proud she was of my accomplishments was privately mocking them to her lover. The betrayal cut deeper than anything I had ever experienced. This was not just about the money or even about Harvard. This was about discovering that the person who was supposed to love and support me unconditionally had been planning my downfall while smiling to my face. She was willing to destroy my future, to fund her affair, and help my sister, who had never shown any real commitment to anything in her life. As I sat there with tears streaming down my face, something inside me shifted. The hurt and disbelief began transforming into something else entirely. A cold, calculating fury that surprised me with its intensity. My mother had taught me to be strategic, to think several moves ahead, to always have a plan. She had no idea that she had just handed me the motivation to use every skill she had helped me develop against her. I spent the rest of that night documenting everything I had found, taking screenshots and saving files to a secure cloud account. If my mother wanted to play games with my future, she was about to learn that I was far better at this than she had ever imagined. The sweet, compliant daughter she thought she knew was about to become her worst nightmare. The next morning, I woke up with a clarity that surprised me. The tears and emotional devastation of the previous night had crystallized into something far more dangerous, a methodical plan for justice. I had spent years watching my mother manipulate situations to her advantage, learning her techniques without even realizing it. Now those same skills would be turned against her. My first step was to understand the full scope of what I was dealing with. I needed to know exactly how deep this conspiracy went and who else might be involved. The Harvard semester had just begun, so I still had time to make strategic moves before any official withdrawal would need to happen. I called the financial aid office and requested a meeting to discuss my options, claiming I was having family financial difficulties. The administrator, Mrs. Rodriguez, was sympathetic and helpful. She explained that my full scholarship was merit-based and could not be transferred to another family member under any circumstances. She also mentioned that Harvard had emergency funding available for students facing unexpected financial hardships. More importantly, she informed me that any attempt to force a withdrawal without the student's consent could result in serious legal complications, especially if there was evidence of financial coercion. This information was the first weapon in my arsenal. My mother clearly had no idea about the legal protections available to students or the fact that my scholarship could not simply be redirected to fund Melody's education. She was operating under assumptions that were completely false, which gave me a significant advantage. Next, I needed to understand Richard Whitmore better. A few hours of online research revealed a man with a pattern of using his family's money and influence to get what he wanted. He had been divorced twice, both times losing significant assets to settlements involving infidelity. His tech startup was indeed struggling, having burned through most of its initial funding with no viable product to show for it. The man was desperate for investment money, which explained why he was so eager to help my mother redirect my education fund. But the most interesting discovery was that Richard's ex-wives had both spoken publicly about his manipulative behavior and his tendency to target married women who had access to family finances. He was essentially a predator who used his charm and social status to convince women to make poor financial decisions that benefited him. Armed with this information, I began to formulate a plan that would expose not just the affair but the entire financial scheme behind it. I needed to gather evidence that would be impossible for my mother to deny or explain away, and I needed to do it in a way that would protect my own interests while ensuring that justice was served. The key was timing and documentation. I spent the next several days creating a detailed timeline of events, complete with screenshots, saved emails, and financial records. I also began discreetly reaching out to people who might serve as witnesses or allies in the coming confrontation. My father was the obvious place to start, but I needed to be careful about how I approached him. He was a good man, but had always been somewhat naive about my mother's true nature. He genuinely loved her and trusted her completely, which is exactly what had made her betrayal possible in the first place. I could not simply dump all of this information on him without preparation. Instead, I decided to begin planting seeds of doubt in subtle ways. During our weekly phone call, I mentioned that I was surprised by my mother's sudden change of heart about my education, especially since she had always been so proud of my achievements. I asked innocent questions about family finances and whether there had been any recent changes or stress that might have influenced her decision. My father's responses confirmed what I had suspected. He had no idea about any of this. He was genuinely confused by my mother's decision and had assumed it was based on conversations between her and me that he was not privy to. He had no knowledge of Richard Whitmore or any connection to the Whitmore Institute. This revelation was both heartening and heartbreaking. It meant that my father was an innocent victim in this situation, just as I was. But it also meant that when the truth came out, it would devastate him in ways that I was not sure he could handle. I also reached out to Emma, Melody's best friend and Richard Whitmore's daughter. We had always gotten along well, and I was curious about what she might know about her father's relationship with my family. I crafted a casual message asking about her college applications and mentioning that Melody was looking at Whitmore Institute. Emma's response was immediate and telling. She was thrilled that Melody was considering Whitmore and mentioned that her father had been really excited about helping with the application process. She also let slip that her father had been spending a lot of time with your family lately, and that she thought it was sweet how much he cares about Melody's future. The innocent way Emma shared this information made it clear that she had no idea about the inappropriate nature of her father's relationship with my mother. To her, this was just a family friend being generous and supportive. But her words confirmed that the affair was an open secret in some circles, even if people did not understand what they were really seeing. As I gathered more information, I began to see the full picture of how my mother and Richard had planned this scheme. They had been careful to create plausible explanations for their behavior while setting up a situation that would benefit them both financially and personally. My mother would get her affair funded by my education money, Richard would get the investment he desperately needed, and Melody would get a college experience she had never earned. The only person whose future did not matter in this equation was me. But what they had not counted on was my willingness to fight back, or my ability to do so effectively. They saw me as the compliant, studious daughter who would accept this betrayal quietly and move on with her life. They had no idea that they had just awakened something in me that would not rest until justice was served. The most important realization I had during this planning phase was that I could not just expose the affair and hope for the best. I needed to create consequences that would be meaningful and lasting. My mother needed to understand that her actions had real costs, not just for me but for herself and everyone else involved in this scheme. This was not going to be a simple confrontation or an emotional outburst. This was going to be a carefully orchestrated campaign that would systematically dismantle everything my mother and Richard had built together while protecting the innocent people who had been caught up in their web of lies. The next phase of my plan required me to think like the lawyer I was training to become. I needed irrefutable evidence, credible witnesses, and a strategy that would hold up under scrutiny. Most importantly, I needed allies who could help me execute this plan without tipping off my mother about what was coming. My first real ally came from an unexpected source, my father's law practice. Jennifer Walsh had been working as his paralegal for over a decade, and she had always treated me like family. When I called her with a vague story about needing advice on family financial matters for a case study I was working on, she immediately offered to help. Jennifer was sharp and experienced, and it did not take her long to read between the lines of my carefully worded questions. When I asked about the legal implications of using education funds for unauthorized purposes, she raised an eyebrow. When I mentioned hypothetical scenarios involving adultery and financial fraud, she set down her coffee cup and looked at me directly. "Serafina, honey, is there something going on at home that I should know about?" she asked gently. The kindness in her voice almost broke my resolve, but I managed to hold it together long enough to explain the situation. Jennifer listened without interruption, her expression growing more serious with each detail. When I finished, she was quiet for a long moment before speaking. "What your mother is doing could constitute several different crimes," she said finally. "Educational fraud, if she is misrepresenting the use of scholarship funds; breach of fiduciary duty, if she is using family assets for personal gain without your father's knowledge; and depending on how the money is structured, potentially embezzlement." She agreed to help me document everything properly and suggested bringing in a private investigator to gather additional evidence about the affair. More importantly, she offered to be present when I eventually confronted my parents, both as a witness and as legal support. My next step was to reach out to my paternal grandmother, Eleanor. She was 83 years old, but sharp as a tack, and she had never particularly liked my mother. More importantly, she controlled a significant family trust that had been helping to pay for my education. If my mother was planning to redirect that money, Grandma Eleanor would need to approve it. When I called her with a casual question about the trust, her response was immediate and angry. "That woman has not contacted me about any changes to your education funding," she said sharply. "And if she thinks she can manipulate me into supporting that lazy sister of yours instead, she has another thing coming." Grandma Eleanor's blunt assessment of the situation was both hilarious and helpful. She agreed to refuse any requests from my mother regarding changes to the trust funding, and she also offered something even more valuable: financial support for my legal defense if things got complicated. "I have been waiting 25 years for your mother to show her true colors," she said with satisfaction. "Now that she has, I intend to make sure there are consequences." With these allies in place, I began the delicate work of gathering additional evidence. The private investigator Jennifer recommended was expensive, but Grandma Eleanor insisted on covering the cost. Within a week, he had provided me with photographs of my mother and Richard entering hotels together, credit card records showing expensive gifts and dinners, and even audio recordings of phone conversations where they discussed their communist plans. The recordings were the most damaging evidence. In one conversation, Richard explicitly discussed how he would arrange for Melody's acceptance to Whitmore Institute in exchange for my mother's investment in his company. In another, my mother laughed about how easy it would be to convince me to give up Harvard because I was such a people-pleaser. But the most devastating recording was one where they discussed what would happen after I withdrew from school. My mother actually said that she hoped the experience would toughen me up and teach me that life is not just about academic achievement. She wanted to use my own dreams and ambitions as a teaching tool to make me more like her. As I listened to these recordings, I felt the last remnants of doubt about my plan disappear. This was not a woman who was making a difficult decision for the good of her family. This was someone who was actively enjoying the power she had over my life and looking forward to watching me struggle. The evidence-gathering phase also revealed some unexpected information about Melody's role in all of this. While I had initially assumed she was an innocent beneficiary of our mother's scheme, it became clear that she knew more than she was letting on. Text messages between her and our mother showed that Melody was actively encouraging the plan and had even suggested ways to convince me to withdraw from Harvard. In one particularly cruel exchange, Melody had written, "Just tell her that Harvard is not that special and that lots of people succeed without fancy degrees. She is so naive, she will probably believe it." This discovery was almost more painful than learning about the affair. I had spent years protecting and supporting my sister, helping her with homework, covering for her when she got in trouble, and defending her against criticism from teachers and family members. To discover that she not only knew about the plan to sabotage my future but was actively participating in it felt like a second betrayal. However, it also simplified my decision-making process. I no longer needed to worry about protecting Melody from the fallout of my actions. She had chosen her side, and now she would live with the consequences. The final piece of evidence I needed was financial documentation showing exactly how my mother planned to redirect my education funds. This required some creative investigation, but my access to the family financial records made it possible. I discovered that she had already begun the process of liquidating some of my college savings and had opened a new investment account in her name only. The paper trail was clear and undeniable. My mother was stealing my education money to fund her affair and her lover's failing business. There was no gray area, no room for alternative interpretations. This was theft, pure and simple. With all of this evidence compiled and organized, I felt ready to move to the next phase of my plan. But before I took any irreversible actions, I wanted to give my mother one final chance to come clean and do the right thing. Not because I believed she would take it, but because I wanted to be absolutely certain that I had given her every opportunity to avoid the consequences that were coming. I decided to arrange a family meeting under the pretense of discussing my college situation. I told my parents that I had been thinking about their request and wanted to have a serious conversation about our family's financial priorities and my future. My mother was delighted, clearly believing that I was preparing to capitulate to her demands. What she did not know was that this meeting would be the beginning of the end of everything she had built with Richard Whitmore. The trap was set, the evidence was gathered, and the allies were in place. All that remained was to spring it and watch her world come crashing down around her. This was going to be the most important conversation of my life, and I was ready for it. The family meeting was scheduled for Saturday afternoon, giving me the entire weekend to execute my plan. I had spent hours rehearsing what I would say and anticipating every possible response my mother might have. Jennifer Walsh would be arriving shortly after the initial conversation began, ostensibly to discuss legal paperwork, but actually to serve as my witness and support. I arrived at the family home early, wanting to set up my recording equipment and prepare the evidence presentation. My mother was in an unusually good mood, humming as she arranged flowers in the living room where we would be having our discussion. She had clearly interpreted my request for a meeting as a sign that I was ready to surrender. "I am so proud of you for being mature about this situation," she said as she fussed with the flower arrangement. "Some children would throw a tantrum, but you understand that family comes first." The casual way she dismissed my devastation as a potential tantrum while praising herself for my supposed maturity was exactly the kind of manipulation I had grown up with. But today, instead of making me doubt myself, it only strengthened my resolve. My father arrived looking somewhat confused about why we needed a formal meeting to discuss something my mother claimed had already been decided. "I thought you girls had already worked this out," he said as he settled into his favorite chair. "Your mother said Serafina was okay with helping Melody pursue her art career." The innocent confusion in his voice reminded me why I was doing this not just for myself, but for him as well. He deserved to know the truth about what his wife had been doing behind his back. "Actually, Dad, there are some things about this situation that I think you need to know," I began carefully. "Before we make any final decisions about my education, I want to make sure everyone has all the relevant information." My mother's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of concern crossing her face. "What kind of information?" she asked, trying to maintain her casual tone. Instead of answering directly, I pulled out my laptop and opened the folder containing all the evidence I had gathered. "I think it would be better if I just showed you both what I discovered." The first document I displayed was the email chain between my mother and Richard Whitmore, discussing their investment plans. I watched my father's face as he read his wife's casual comments about redirecting my college fund to help Richard's struggling business. The confusion in his expression slowly transformed into something much more serious. "What is this?" he asked quietly, looking at my mother. "Who is Richard Whitmore, and why are you discussing our daughter's education money with him?" My mother's face had gone completely white, but she tried to maintain her composure. Richard is just a family friend who has been helping with college consultations. There is nothing inappropriate about discussing educational investments. Educational investments, I repeated, pulling up the next set of documents. Is that what you call hotel receipts and expensive dinners? Because I have months of credit card records showing exactly how you have been consulting with Mr. Whitmore. The hotel receipts were damning. Multiple occasions where my mother had charged rooms to her credit card during times when she claimed to be attending business conferences or visiting friends. The timing matched perfectly with Richard's travel schedule, which the private investigator had also documented. My father stared at the evidence in complete silence, his face cycling through confusion, disbelief, and finally a dawning understanding that was painful to watch. "You have been having an affair," he said, not as a question but as a statement of fact. "It is not what you think," my mother began, but I cut her off by playing one of the audio recordings. Her own voice filled the room, laughing about how naive I was and discussing the details of her scheme with Richard. In the recording, she explicitly talked about using my withdrawal from Harvard to fund their investment plans and secure Melody's admission to Whitmore Institute through Richard's family connections. The sound of her own words seemed to drain all the fight out of my mother. She sank into her chair, no longer able to maintain the facade of innocent family planning. But I was not done yet. The next piece of evidence was the documentation showing that she had already begun moving money out of my education accounts without authorization. Bank records, investment transfers, and account statements painted a clear picture of financial fraud. "This is not just about the affair," I said, looking directly at my father. "This is about theft. She has been stealing my college fund to bankroll her relationship and help her lover's business. And she convinced Melody to help her do it." The text message exchanges between my mother and sister were perhaps the most devastating evidence of all. Melody's enthusiastic participation in the scheme and her cruel comments about my naivety showed that this was not a desperate decision made in a moment of weakness. This was a calculated conspiracy designed to benefit everyone except me. My father read through the messages in complete silence, his expression growing darker with each revelation. When he finished, he looked at my mother with an expression I had never seen before. "How could you do this to our daughter?" he asked quietly. "How could you do this to our family?" Before my mother could respond, the doorbell rang. Jennifer Walsh's arrival was perfectly timed, and her presence immediately shifted the dynamic in the room. As my father's paralegal, she was someone he trusted and respected, and her professional demeanor made it clear that this situation had moved beyond family drama into legal territory. "I am sorry to interrupt," Jennifer said, carrying a briefcase full of legal documents. "But Serafina asked me to prepare some paperwork regarding the unauthorized use of educational funds and potential criminal charges." The mention of criminal charges finally broke my mother's composure completely. "You cannot be serious," she said, looking at me with a mixture of shock and betrayal. "I am your mother. You cannot press charges against your own mother." "Watch me," I replied calmly. "You made your choice when you decided to steal my future to fund your affair. Now you get to live with the consequences." Jennifer laid out the legal documents on the coffee table, explaining each one in detail. There were papers to freeze the family accounts to prevent further unauthorized transfers, documents to report the educational fraud to the appropriate authorities, and most importantly, a civil lawsuit seeking full restitution for the stolen funds plus damages. But the real shock came when Jennifer explained that the private investigator's evidence had been shared with Richard Whitmore's ex-wives, who were now considering their own legal action for pattern fraud. Apparently, using family money to fund affairs and fake business investments was a recurring theme in Richard's relationships. My mother stared at the legal documents as if they might disappear if she looked long enough. "This will destroy our family," she whispered. "You already destroyed our family," I replied. "I am just making sure there are consequences." The meeting continued for another hour, with Jennifer methodically explaining each legal filing and its potential consequences. My mother would face criminal charges for financial fraud. The stolen money would need to be returned immediately with interest. and the evidence of her affair would become part of the public record through the legal proceedings. More importantly, the documentation we had gathered would be shared with Whitmore Institute, exposing the admission scheme that Richard had promised to arrange for Melody. There would be no special treatment, no guaranteed acceptance, and no scholarship money that never existed anyway. My father listened to everything in stunned silence, occasionally asking clarifying questions, but mostly just absorbing the magnitude of what his wife had done. When Jennifer finished her presentation, he looked at my mother with an expression that held no trace of the love and trust that had defined their marriage. "I want you out of the house tonight," he said quietly. "You can stay with your sister or find a hotel, but I cannot look at you right now." My mother tried to protest, claiming that we were overreacting and that the situation could be resolved without involving lawyers. But the evidence was too overwhelming, and the betrayal too complete. She had gambled everything on her ability to manipulate and control the situation, and she had lost. As she packed her bags, I felt a mixture of satisfaction and sadness watching her world fall apart. This was not how I had wanted things to end, but it was the natural consequence of her choices. She had taught me to value justice and accountability, and now those lessons were being applied to her own behavior. The 24 hours following our family meeting were a whirlwind of activity that left everyone involved reeling from the speed and thoroughness of the consequences. My mother had underestimated not just my willingness to fight back, but also my ability to execute a comprehensive response that would address every aspect of her betrayal. The first domino to fall was Richard Whitmore's business investment scheme. Jennifer had coordinated with a financial crimes investigator who specialized in investment fraud, and by Monday morning, Richard's company accounts were frozen pending a full audit. The investigator was particularly interested in the pattern of targeting married women for investment money, which aligned perfectly with complaints from his ex-wives. Richard's panicked phone calls to my mother started early Monday morning and continued throughout the day. I knew about them because the court order Jennifer had obtained required my mother to surrender her phone as part of the evidence preservation process. Each call showed increasing desperation as Richard realized that his meal ticket was evaporating and that he might face serious criminal charges. The investigation into Richard's business revealed that it was essentially a shell company designed to funnel money from his various romantic conquests into his personal accounts. The revolutionary tech startup he had described to my mother was nothing more than a barely functional website and some impressive-sounding business documents. Every dollar she had given him had gone directly into funding his lifestyle and paying off debts from previous failed schemes. Meanwhile, the complaint filed with Whitmore Institute created immediate problems for Melody's college prospects. The admissions office launched their own investigation into potential bribery and preferential treatment, which resulted in her application being flagged for additional scrutiny. More damaging, however, was the fact that the scholarship Richard had promised was completely fictional. The institute had no record of any special funding arrangements, and Richard had no authority to make such promises. Melody's reaction to these developments was perhaps the most telling aspect of the entire situation. Instead of showing remorse for her role in the conspiracy, she was furious that the plan had fallen apart. She accused me of being jealous and vindictive, claiming that I was destroying her future out of spite. "You could have just gone to a state school," she screamed during one particularly heated phone call. "Did you really have to ruin everything for everyone just to prove a point?" Her complete inability to understand that she had participated in stealing my education money was both infuriating and illuminating. She genuinely believed that she deserved to benefit from my hard work and sacrifice, and that my resistance to this arrangement was unreasonable. But the most significant development was my father's decision to file for divorce immediately. The financial fraud and affair were devastating enough, but the discovery that my mother had been systematically lying about her activities for months had destroyed any possibility of reconciliation. He moved quickly to protect his assets and ensure that my education fund would be restored before my mother could cause any additional damage. The divorce proceedings revealed even more disturbing information about my mother's behavior. Financial records showed that the affair with Richard was not her first indiscretion, just the first one that had involved stealing family money. There had been a pattern of deception and manipulation that went back years, hidden beneath the facade of the devoted wife and mother. My father's attorney, working in coordination with Jennifer, was able to recover most of the money that had been transferred to Richard's accounts before they were frozen. The court ordered immediate restitution and placed liens on both my mother's and Richard's assets to ensure compliance. But perhaps the most satisfying consequence was the impact on my mother's social standing in our community. The legal proceedings became a matter of public record, and news of the affair and financial fraud spread quickly through her social circles. The woman who had spent years cultivating an image as the perfect wife and mother was now exposed as someone who had betrayed her family in the most fundamental way possible. Her book club friends stopped calling. The charity organizations where she had served on boards quietly requested her resignation. Even her own sister, who had initially offered her a place to stay, became increasingly uncomfortable with the situation as more details emerged. The isolation and public humiliation were clearly taking a toll on my mother's mental state. She made several attempts to contact me directly, alternating between apologies and accusations, but I had blocked her communications on the advice of my legal team. Any contact between us would need to go through attorneys until the criminal and civil cases were resolved. Richard Whitmore faced even more severe consequences. The investigation into his business revealed connections to other fraudulent schemes, and federal authorities became involved when evidence emerged of wire fraud and tax evasion. His arrest made the local news, further damaging any remaining credibility he might have had. The collapse of Richard's operation also affected other families who had been targeted by his schemes. Several other women came forward with similar stories of being convinced to invest family money in his fake business ventures. The scope of his fraud was much larger than anyone had initially realized. Throughout this chaos, I maintained my focus on my education and future plans. The restored funding meant that I could continue at Harvard without interruption, and the legal resolution provided closure that allowed me to move forward without constantly looking over my shoulder. But the emotional impact of the entire situation was complex and difficult to process. While I felt vindicated by the swift justice and complete exposure of my mother's betrayal, I also grieved for the family relationships that had been destroyed. The mother I thought I knew had never really existed, and coming to terms with that reality was an ongoing process. The support from my father, grandmother, and legal team was crucial during this period. They helped me understand that seeking justice was not the same as seeking revenge, and that holding people accountable for their actions was both appropriate and necessary. Most importantly, they helped me recognize that my mother's betrayal was a reflection of her character, not mine. I had done nothing to deserve this treatment, and my response had been both measured and appropriate given the circumstances. 6 months after that devastating family meeting, I found myself sitting in my Harvard dorm room writing the final paper of my first-year constitutional law course. The topic I had chosen was particularly fitting: the intersection of family law and financial crimes in cases of domestic fraud. My professor had no idea that I was writing from personal experience, but the research and analysis felt deeply meaningful in ways that went far beyond academic achievement. The legal proceedings against my mother and Richard Whitmore had concluded with outcomes that exceeded even my most optimistic expectations. My mother pled guilty to financial fraud and received 3 years of probation, along with an order to pay full restitution plus damages. Richard faced federal charges and was sentenced to 2 years in prison, with additional restitution requirements for the multiple families he had defrauded. The criminal convictions meant that both my education fund and my father's retirement accounts were fully restored, with interest and penalties paid by the perpetrators. More importantly, the legal precedent set by our case had helped several other families recover money that had been stolen through similar schemes. Melody's college situation had resolved itself in ways that taught her important lessons about accountability and consequences. Without Richard's fictional influence, her application to Whitmore Institute was rejected based on her actual academic performance. She eventually enrolled in a community college art program, which was more appropriate for her skill level and work ethic anyway. Initially, she had blamed me for ruining her dreams, but over time she began to understand that those dreams had been built on lies and theft from the beginning. Our relationship remained strained, but she had started to acknowledge her role in the conspiracy and expressed genuine remorse for her actions. The most healing aspect of this entire experience had been watching my father rebuild his life with dignity and strength. The divorce was finalized within 4 months thanks to the overwhelming evidence of fraud and adultery that made my mother's position completely untenable. He had taken early retirement from his law practice and was now volunteering with legal aid organizations that helped families dealing with financial fraud. "You know what I learned from all this," he told me during one of our weekly phone calls. "Sometimes the people who hurt us the most do us the biggest favor. If your mother had not shown her true colors, I might have spent the rest of my life married to someone who never really existed." His perspective on forgiveness and moving forward had been instrumental in helping me process my own emotions about the situation. I had initially struggled with guilt about the nuclear-level consequences my actions had created, but he helped me understand that those consequences were the natural result of my mother's choices, not mine. Grandma Eleanor had become an even more important figure in my life, serving as both a source of wisdom and a living reminder that family loyalty should never come at the expense of justice. She had established an additional education trust that would ensure I could complete not just my undergraduate degree but law school as well, without ever worrying about financial manipulation again. "Your mother did you a favor, even though she did not mean to," Grandma Eleanor observed during one of our monthly lunch meetings. "She showed you exactly what kind of person you do not want to become, and she taught you that standing up for yourself is not just acceptable, it is necessary." The experience had fundamentally changed my career aspirations as well. While I had originally planned to focus on corporate law, I was now drawn to family law and financial crimes. The intersection of legal expertise and personal justice that I had discovered during my own case felt like a calling that combined my academic interests with meaningful social impact. I had already begun volunteering with organizations that help students navigate educational fraud and family financial disputes. The skills I had developed during my own legal battle were directly applicable to helping other young people who found themselves in similar situations. But perhaps the most important growth I experienced was in my understanding of what family really means. The betrayal by my mother and sister had been devastating, but it had also clarified the difference between biological relationships and genuine family bonds. Jennifer Walsh had become like a second mother to me, providing guidance and support that went far beyond her professional obligations. My father and grandmother formed the core of my new family structure, based on mutual respect and genuine care rather than manipulation and obligation. I had also developed friendships at Harvard that were built on honesty and shared values. These relationships felt more authentic and meaningful than the family dynamics I had grown up with, which had been based on my willingness to sacrifice my own interests for others. The most unexpected positive outcome was the relationship I had developed with Emma Whitmore, Richard's daughter. She had been horrified to learn about her father's behavior and had reached out to apologize for his actions. Our friendship had grown from that initial connection, and she had become one of my closest confidants at school. "It is weird how our parents' terrible choices brought us together," she had observed. "But I think we are both better people for having gone through this experience." Looking back on the entire ordeal, I felt a profound sense of closure and empowerment. The scared, hurt girl who had received that devastating phone call about dropping out of Harvard had transformed into a confident young woman who understood her own worth and was willing to fight for her future. The legal victory had been satisfying, but the personal growth had been even more valuable. I had learned that setting boundaries was not selfish, that seeking justice was not vengeful, and that sometimes the people who claim to love us the most can be the ones who hurt us the deepest. Most importantly, I had learned that my worth was not determined by other people's treatment of me. My mother's betrayal said nothing about my value as a person and everything about her character flaws and poor judgment. As I finished writing my constitutional law paper, I reflected on how this experience would shape my future career and personal relationships. I was no longer naive about the potential for betrayal and manipulation, but I had not become cynical or closed off from meaningful connections. Instead, I had developed the ability to recognize authentic relationships and the courage to walk away from situations that did not serve my best interests. These skills would be valuable not just in my personal life but in my professional career as well. The story that had begun with such devastating betrayal had evolved into one of justice, growth, and empowerment. While I would never choose to go through this experience again, I was grateful for the lessons it had taught me and the strength it had revealed within myself. Now, as I prepare to continue my journey through law school and beyond, I carry with me the knowledge that I can overcome even the most challenging obstacles when I stand up for what is right. The girl who was almost forced to drop out of Harvard because her mother needed the money more had become a woman who would never again allow anyone to diminish her dreams or steal her future. Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and doing what was right? Sometimes the people we trust most are the ones who hurt us deepest, but standing up for ourselves can lead to the most powerful transformations. I want to hear your thoughts about family karma and justice in the comments below. Have you experienced a situation where someone tried to sacrifice your dreams for their benefit? How did you handle it? Your story might help someone else going through a similar betrayal. If this family revenge story taught you anything about recognizing manipulation and fighting for your future, please hit that like button and subscribe for more real-life stories about justice and empowerment. Share this video with anyone who needs to hear that they have the power to stand up against betrayal, even when it comes from family. Thank you for listening to my story and for being part of this community where we support each other through difficult family situations. Remember that seeking justice is not about revenge. It is about ensuring that our actions have meaning and that people are held accountable for their choices. I wish you all the strength to recognize your own worth and the courage to defend your dreams against anyone who tries to diminish them. Until next time, keep fighting for the life you deserve and never let anyone convince you that your future matters less than their convenience.